Games Workshop sent me the new Warhammer Quest before release, which is awesome, but there is one small problem. Along with the box, you get a chance to be featured on Warhammer Community, if you can finish your mini in time. And because of other projects, I really didn't have much, but I did wanna be featured. So today I'll show you how I painted the main villain from the box in days rather than weeks. And you can use all of that to paint faster without losing too much on quality. First of all, rather than starting from black, I started with a zenithal highlight. There are two reasons why I wanna start like this instead of just black. First one is better coverage. It's probably the most common reason why people do that, so I don't have to talk about it too much. But perhaps more importantly, this is great light sketch. If I was painting plenty of shiny, reflective materials, starting with black is not a bad idea, because finding the reflections is easier. But this guy doesn't really have too many shiny things. There are some bits, but for the most part he is pretty matte. The very first thing I paint is the skin. And what's quite unusual is that I start from a mid-tone. Whenever I paint something nurgly, I consider the skin to be the most important part. You can play around with different colors to depict just how sickly this guy is. The point I'm making here is that if you wanna paint something fast without compromising quality, start with the most important parts. At the start of your project, you'll have the most time and energy, so this sets you up for success. Okay, so why did I start with a mid-tone? Well, it allows me to do something I couldn't do if I started dark. Going forward, I am using various saturated colors to stain the surface. It really doesn't matter if you call it a wash or a glaze, it's just watery paint, okay? As long as you have decent control over it, it's all good. All of these colors will make the skin feel more sickly, more interesting, and also shaded. You can go absolutely wild with it and use whatever saturated colors you want. Whether it is yellow for hepatitis, purple for swelling, or worst of all, blue for ligma. I gotta be honest, the skin took me more than a day to finish. That's a lot given the time constraint, but again, I cared for it the most. After I stained and shaded the miniature enough, I can be more surgical in my approach. Generally, you can start painting anything quite messy and then refine it later. This allows you more freedom, makes you faster, and still leaves you room to make it better. What you see me do here is rendering the shapes on the skin. Maybe it's not obvious at first, but his fupa, by the way fupa stands for fatter upper pubic area, super important to know, is composed of multiple fatty lumps. That's actually true for his arm as well. The reason why I mention this is because you gotta think about the overall shape first, and then care about the smaller shapes later. So here, for example, you could say his belly is like a sphere, and therefore there is a shade at the bottom. Then, when you look at the smaller lumps, most of them are also spherical. So at the bottom of each sphere, you'll notice a slight shade. It's not a dark line which you would use for armor panels, but a subtle shade separating each of the lumps. That's how we paint volume, and it's exactly how I painted all of the skin. This messy approach continues at the top, so a very harsh start followed by a more precise paint application, ultimately leading to defining those smaller shapes. right in the middle of his body is this ugly sore. And although I call it ugly, it's an excellent spot to include more saturated colors. So I painted it using orange, yellow, and a bit of pistachio. And our little ugly duckling grew into a gross swan. Yes, it is a small detail, but it's the middle of the figure, so it does deserve more attention. After some more touch-ups, I am really happy with the skin. It looks hideous, in a good way. It almost makes me wanna make a yo mama joke. Following that, I painted the face. It's always a good idea to start with the most inner parts of your mini. In this case, the teeth. In this instance, I have two things to say. First one, if you wanna pick out each individual tooth, don't use paint that's too watery. If you do, you might spill it everywhere and screw yourself over. So the more precise you wanna be, the less watery paint you gotta use. And it's exactly the same with edge highlights. And also, the teeth really shouldn't be white. This guy doesn't give a shit about brushing his teeth. He's blessed by Nurgle, not Colgate. I also finished his face exactly the same way as other skin. Now, real quick, if you're watching this, I assume that you care about improving your miniatures. In which case, you might be interested in my newsletter. There I share extra tips and tricks that don't always make it into a video. So if you wanna level up your painting, there will be a link in the description, so check it out. Anyway, at this point I kinda realized I am running out of time, and the miniature has barely anything painted. The stuff I do have is really nice, and it will do the heavy lifting when it comes to the overall impression. Yet still, I had to turn on my supersonic speed and base code everything. Another part on my plate were these hooves. Generally speaking, it's easier to paint something harsh, textured or weathered. So for that reason, I am painting simple texture here. It'll be a nice touch, and I can mostly focus on the edges and paint various scratches in the middle. I'm also way more comfortable starting from dark base coats going forward. That's because other parts won't have nearly as much visual variety, and I won't have to use watery paint. Now, at this point, I wanna talk about which features determine how long it takes to paint a model. Like, obviously, if I was painting a Nurgling, it would be faster. However, it wouldn't be because it's smaller, but because it doesn't have many elements. The more weapons, armor plates, trinkets, and all kinds of different BS a miniature has, the longer it takes to paint. Just imagine I was painting a Nurgling 2 times the size of this miniature. Although there would be more space to cover, it would still be way faster to finish, because most of it would be just a few colors. This guy, on the other hand, has so many elements and features, it's kinda crazy. He has 2 weapons, sickly skin, multiple colors on armor, horns, hooves, fabric, various metals, a skull, and I can go on and on. It's a metric shit ton of details. On top of that, the skin has various holes, cracks and sores, and even the other materials have sculpted weathering. This, in fact, multiplies the time spent on a miniature. Perhaps I should have gone for one of the heroes instead of painting one of the most complicated minis. Actually, when you look at the heroes, they don't have nearly as many elements as the Nurgle half of the box. And I mean, it's really cool having such a variety, but it genuinely takes longer to paint. Which is not the best when you are in a rush. As I started working on the metals, I needed faster solution to finish him in time. Looking at the box art, you can see that there is plenty of rust all over the place. So after painting some simple reflections on these rings, that's exactly what I'm adding as well. Making something broken, weathered and dirty is way easier than making something clean and polished. It actually works the same way in real life. It's easier to fuck something up rather than fix it. The first solution is dirty down rust effect. At first this might seem quite effective, but unfortunately it's a bit unpredictable. Sometimes it dries a bit too light, sometimes a bit too dark. Of course, factors like the amount of liquid and the way it dries do affect it, so maybe a more consistent solution are dry pigments. So that's what I use going forward. Actually, both of the weapons will use dry pigments to a great effect. Before doing that, I still gotta paint the sword with faces. It's as simple as sketching out the reflections first and blending them later with midtones. Now, I say that kinda casually, but that doesn't mean it's fast. Keep in mind that I'm showing you edited process and everything takes many times longer. Weapons and faces are usually focal points of your miniature. There are some exceptions, but this isn't one of them. In fact, this very sword features faces. So again, yes, I should be in a rush, but this is the one part I can't dismiss. The weapon now almost complete, it's time to use the secret sauce again. I used a combination of dry pigment, a little bit of orange and water. And just by applying it into shades and recesses, holy shit, does it make the handles so much better. Magnifique. The other weapon will undergo the same process, but there is one major difference. Given it's not as interesting as the sword, I decided to sketch it so hard and so harsh it would make a 6-year-old blush. But as you'll see, it's all part of the plan. There will be 2 steps on top to make it better. The first one is to go over the edges again. It's not important to make the most precise edge highlights, but it'll give it that nice definition. The second step will make it way more interesting. Just like before, I combined dry pigment with a bit of orange, added plenty of water, and applied it over the entire thing. If the texture was too harsh, this makes it way more subtle. Sometimes I tend to use my airbrush to speedrun the drying process, and already it looks so much better, and it was painted in like 10 minutes. Now, since the pigment muted even those edge highlights, I wanted to make it pop again. So on the most exposed edges, I add another pass with light gray. And there we go. Now, if you're wondering why did I paint everything in this order, it actually has a purpose. If I ignore the smallest details, all that's left is the armor, copper, and some leather. And all of these parts can be painted super easily by texturing them, specifically by using texture blending. I know it sounds like I am making shit up, but I've mentioned this in the past, so let me explain on this shoulder pad. And again, I've painted the green armor, leather, and copper in a very similar way. so these were probably the easiest parts. The reason why it's called texture blending is because you are painting texture that's not super harsh. It's not that different from regular layering, but you'll notice an important change. Instead of building a solid layer one by one, I paint the layer with lines and dots to represent texture. And those tiny gaps in between the brushstrokes create that textured impression. Of course, you can make it more subtle with a glaze or two on top, but that's not super important. With every additional layer, you cover less of the surface, but also use smaller lines and dots. And as I add more and more, you'll see that it becomes reflective, because I place the layers towards the light. And still, it does look textured, because of those tiny gaps between the layers. So if you wanna paint texture with a nice finish, this is my favorite way to do it. In the end, obviously there are some parts I would paint differently if I had more time. Still, it's super exciting that Warhammer community featured my model, and that's all that matters. Anyway, if you found this useful and you wanna push your miniatures to another level, check out this video next because it'll help you with that. And see you there!